I am an architect by training, so I think that was why I got brought on to assist my colleagues Lisa and Sean. And I kind of, in the beginning, I assisted with the ethnographic research stream, and then on top of that also looked at the different upgrading models from a more architectural perspective. So just to set the scene, currently in South Africa, or in 2013, there were 2,600 informal settlements, whereas in '94 there were only 300, so a huge increase. But more looking closely at the Western Cape, there are about 300,000 households within informal settlements, housing about 850 plus thousand people. And we've been focusing mostly in our research on those living in informal settlements, not in backyards, but that's quite a big number. So basically, just to sort of ask the question, who's doing what in this landscape? So zooming in on the city of Cape Town, who've kind of promised to spend that amount in the next 3 years in informal settlement upgrading. It's also an interesting question to then look at what individuals are capable of or able to spend. So we had one of the research streams that Lisa mentioned was our financial stream that Kaiser did for us, or they assisted and consulted. So we looked at the sector of the 0 to 6,400 income bracket. Of those households, over 230,000 spend less than 400 Rand a month on maintenance and utilities, including upgrading. So basically the typical paradigm in South Africa has been sort of looking at top structure, focusing on the top structure, focusing on the end product. However, in reality, what has happened is government hasn't been able to supply the demand as they've been trying to do. And people have been waiting for many years, since '94. So basically, the question is, what is happening now? So we're seeing a shift in the policy landscape away from sort of providing sort of a serviced land with top structure to more sort of developing a human settlements approach or emphasis and looking at incremental upgrading. So basically that's where this work kind of came in for us to look at to assist our research, our ethnographic research, and eventually the Better Living Challenge too. And basically the scope of this research work looked at sort of what are the different things or models that sort of people are employing to upgrade. So what are these upgrading typologies or built forms or planning processes or ideas or conceptual approaches. And basically this is to understand what is actually happening on the ground. So the way that I did this was, and the way that we looked at this was looking at ideas on paper. So what's been suggested, what's been drawn, what's been theorized, but what hasn't necessarily happened in practice. So what are all the projects sitting in the library shelves of different architectural sort of schools around the world? What's online, what ideas have been shared, moving to practice. So what has actually been built locally and internationally, and then also looking at place. So they're zooming in on case studies. So that's where Claire would come in later from PEP, who will actually be presenting a case study as well. So basically in this process, we were also asking the constant question, sort of, what do we mean by upgrading? Is it merely a physical process where you end up with an actual built sort of product? And there has been quite a focus on the sort of top structure approach, where communities and people and government focus on this. What are we getting out of the process? What will the house look like? And through this process, we uncovered that the process is almost more important than the actual end product. But basically, in this sort of the scope of work, we very well briefly looked at sort of these three streams, but then identifying as we were going along the sort of the different models that were out there, which I'll get into more detail now. Basically looking at and still counting 205 projects from more than 25 countries, including 50 sort of ideas on paper, and then also 155 projects in practice. So just to sort of, which I can come back to later, but the importance of the research was to try and find outliers or just going beyond the sort of the typical in terms of precedent, because we often revert back to the typical case studies or typical precedent when looking for examples of upgrading. but I'll get into those examples later. So basically, these 11 models, just to briefly go through them, which were identified, was looking at material innovation, and Lisa mentioned some of those in our previous BLC1 competition challenge. So those would be good examples of sort of material innovation that's actually happening in the space at the moment. To top structure, which there's quite a huge emphasis on. So there's a lot of precedent, there's a lot of precedent out there on top structure examples. Moving on to site and service, self-help build, mutual aid projects, to reblocking, and I'll go into detail in just a second, to transitional housing and post-disaster units, to community facilitation and development, and then community-led finance facilities, as well as public infrastructure, tenure provision, and multi-scale interventions. So these were all different ways or methods or sort of models that were identified in this research process. And basically, just to go into 5 of these examples, I won't go into all 11. But how many of you are familiar with the Empower Shack project on the left? So a few of you are. So I think Andy will be speaking to us later about that project. But basically, the project to its right in the middle from Chile is a very good example of sort of a top structure approach. And the reason why is highlighted is you can see on the third image, on the second image from the right, how this sort of typology has allowed for infill, for additions to be done. So only 50% of the actual volume or unit is provided by the government or by the city, where the tenant can then fill in the rest. So that's just one of the multiple examples that were looked at. And then on the right, you have a more typical sort of top structure solution, the Mamelodi pod. So there are various of these kind of iterations happening around the country, sort of your typical sort of green shack or cool shack kind of reiterations popping up all over the place. And these sort of often are less successful because they rely often too much on outsiders' sort of input and ideas, and often don't originate from the people who this actual structure is built for. So I think the projects on the left sort of have actually done the opposite though, and Andy will be going into more detail in her project later. The second one that I've decided to show is of the 11 models is site and service and core services. So what we're seeing in the policy landscape, or the shift in the policy landscape, is moving away from sort of a fully built top structure RDP house or serviced site as well, moving to probably a more service site approach. So what that might entail is still undecided, but these examples show sort of examples of where it has been adapted or used. And we've seen this happen in certain spots in South Africa as well, in Durban and in the city of Cape Town. And the picture the second to your right is example in Blikkiesdorp as well, even though those were only toilets. But basically this is probably where we will probably be heading in the city of Cape Town and in the Western Cape. But the way that this is done is of crucial importance. Then moving to self-help build and mutual aid projects. So the one on the left was the roof aid scheme in Ghana. Sorry, that's Honduras, sorry. And this project was sort of relied on the owner to build up to a certain level, and then the rest of the sort of the roof and the structure would be provided by the government authorities. So there was an added incentive, as well as people had to provide some kind of sort of self-aid as well. And then reblocking and the city upgrading is another one that I've chosen to highlight. Here you can see Flamingo Crescent, and on the right, Cuckoo Town. So these projects, for those who don't know what sort of reblocking means, just basically means taking an existing informal settlement and literally reblocking or moving the sort of structures around in a way to allow for more access of services, possibly wider roads, also to prevent the sort of spread of fire if there might be a fire, but also to also mitigate flooding. So I think in these projects, the one on the right in Cuckoo Town happened prior to Flamingo Crescent. So you can see the level of services are slightly different, also more paving. But basically, this is a strategy that's been adopted by the City of Cape Town and will probably be rolled out sort of quite more in the near future. And then another one that I chose to highlight as well was transitional housing or post-disaster units. The reason for doing so, including this in our precedent analysis, was because the City of Cape Town, often after a fire has broken out or there's been a flood, they come with the sort of typical sort of these post-disaster kits or shacks, which they build. And often these are just 4 walls and a roof. And these are often used in sort of the new IDAs and basically this typology is something to be looked at because this is possibly an area for intervention or for investigation that could be looked at as well. And then in terms of key observations that came out of the research was, again, like I've mentioned before, that policy is shifting away from a Dralik-centric approach to a more wider human settlement approach, and that they are looking at different precedent options, that there are different options available. And the idea that security of Kenya is key to projects being successful. Something that came up as well in many of the projects we looked at was the access to well-located land being crucial. And then also sort of just flipping to the last one, basically sort of the idea that housing as a process being key and it not just being a focus on the top structure, but possibly in the way you get there. So just going into a few more examples before I wrap up. This is something that was said by Side before judging, try and understand it. So this, Heinrich Wolff had this very interesting body of research that he did on Dunoon, trying to understand the Dunoon informal settlement that was then upgraded. And he basically took 6 years to conduct this research. And he's been presenting that research recently, and what he tried to do was just to understand what was happening in that community and trying to get a sense for why people were building the way they were. And I think that's sort of an important lesson to be learned, was sort of before going in and assessing informal settlements before upgrading, is seeing what's working, what's happening, what residents are doing, what they're doing themselves already, and trying to aid that in those processes. This is just a photo of another sort of reblocking exercise. So the bigger picture, you can see sort of a new sort of street frontage has been created, a water point, and then a toilet block. But what I think certain other projects suggest or show, like in Power Shack in the sort of insert picture, is how that same typology could be possibly upscaled or built in a slightly different way, that one doesn't necessarily walk into the house with your toilet facing your front door. So that we'll be going into that case study in a few more minutes. Then basically another sort of thing that came up was sort of the status quo of just providing standard toilets, standard plastic basins, and how possibly that provision could be done slightly differently with the actual participation of communities and residents. Like the example on the right, Monrobisi Park, where UCT students got involved with the building of new water points, which also serves a creche alongside. But basically there the community was involved in how that specific structure would be designed and built. And then moving to sort of two international examples of where possibly if we are going site and service, so this is just throwing sort of playing devil's advocate, but possibly throwing two examples of precedent out there of how when one provides something, could that sort of structure being provided as a site and service model for each plot possibly be something slightly different or something more than just a toilet block. So here coming back to sort of what was also found in multiple of the precedent studies was this sort of idea or want from outside sort of designers or architects to come in with sort of retrofitted solutions to shacks, like the green shack or the cool shack, and often these sort of, possibly with good intention, not having the desired effect that was considered in the beginning or desired. This is the cool shack example that was developed by a group of UCT students with a few of their professors in the engineering department, testing new materials which are more thermally efficient to try and cool down the temperatures within shacks. And this is still being prototyped. And then just sort of another sort of just, again, highlighting sort of the ideas that are out there at the moment that has come up through sort of trawling through different precedent studies from different universities and also online was, and this is just one example of a sort of a recent thesis project looking at informal settlement upgrading, where it was proposed that sort of there'd be an emphasis on creating a high street. So kind of acknowledging what the role or the sort of role of all the different role players were meant to be, and what sort of they should be doing themselves. So sort of acknowledging that people could possibly be building their own houses themselves, constructing their own houses, but possibly when it came to more public infrastructure, there it would be the role of the government to provide that as well. So, and then basically, this was just another example that I mentioned earlier, where acknowledging that sort of when providing some kind of top structure to also allow for the creativity of the individual to sort of also have a place for them to construct something. And then this is an example which has recently been completed in Philippi by Nero Architects. So basically what happened here was there was a desire for, from one of the NGOs to test this. The idea behind this was using sort of a very simple symbolic idea of the table as sort of some kind of shelter against which sort of the homeowner could then sort of wrap or attach their sort of structure to. And the idea was then that they could then also build some kind of structure on top. So that was just one of the examples that's kind of been unearthed or that is sort of popping up around. They haven't yet built another one after this one. And then this is another local example which I think started, which is a permutation of previous sort of similar top structure approaches by this designer. This one being in Pretoria, and it being called the Lighthouse. So basically it's built from sort of, it uses some kind of sort of fire retardant paint as well. And you can see that they're sort of testing the sort of, testing it with a fire. But basically how this unit is built is using 4 posts around an existing shack. So acknowledging that people won't be relocated to other sites. So basically this house or unit is constructed off-site, the panels are brought in and it's constructed in one day, the ground floor sort of part, and then a slab is cast, and then the first floor unit is built, and then the owners of the shack down below can move upstairs. So that's also another example of where people, sort of acknowledging that people won't be relocated, but possibly being able to upgrade while people live in their current home. And this is just an example, one last example of in Colombia where sort of, okay, the terrain looks very different to what we have here on the Cape Flats or in the city of Cape Town. In most of our informal settlements are mostly flat. But this example sort of, I think the sort of important point to acknowledge was where these projects were often successful in some of these cities in Colombia was because of the buy-in from all levels of government and all different stakeholders, and having a dedicated unit for informal or slum upgrading, informal settlement upgrading. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.